Most people think the danger in marriage comes from big, dramatic betrayals. But sometimes, it's the slow drip of little cuts, the offhand remarks. It's the polite corrections, the subtle way a room falls silent when you speak that can hollow a person out. Laura Bennett thought she had found her forever, a hard-working freelance graphic designer from a modest Midwestern town. She'd fallen head over heels for David Caldwell, a polished executive from Boston's elite. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of candlelit dinners and weekend getaways. By the time they exchanged vows, Laura believed she wasn't just marrying a man, she was joining a family. The Caldwells were everything her own upbringing wasn't. Affluent, connected, steeped in generations of knowing the right people. At first, Laura tried to see their quirks as charm. Margaret, the matriarch, would comment on her darling little design projects as if they were schoolcrafts. Richard, the patriarch, liked to explain basic marketing concepts to her and Ever. Mind her years of running her own business. And Emily, David's sister, had a knack for delivering corrections with a sugar-sweet smile. Whether it was about pronouncing a wine varietal or choosing the appropriate dress for a gala, David brushed it off. Well, but deep down, Laura could feel that their approval was conditional, their welcome lukewarm. And as the years went on, she began to wonder, what happens when the small cuts finally reach the bone? It happened on a rainy Tuesday in early spring, just past their 7th wedding anniversary. Laura had been quietly scaling back her design. Business for years, something that was never openly discussed. Only silently expected so she could manage their home while David traveled for work. He thrived on red-eye flights, high-stakes meetings, and the glow of corporate achievement. Laura kept the household running, paying bills, making sure the fridge was stocked, and trying to keep the warmth in a marriage that felt increasingly one-sided. Then came the news she had longed for. She was pregnant. It wasn't planned, but when she saw the faint pink line, she allowed herself to hope this might be the new chapter they both needed. David was on a week-long business trip to San Francisco, but when she told him over the phone, he'd sounded genuinely happy at least. In that first moment, the following weeks were a blur of small preparations, looking at nursery colors, imagining little feet running across the hardwood floors. But at 11 weeks, the cramping started. The bleeding followed. Alone in their quiet suburban home, she drove herself to the ER, clutching her coat around her like a shield. By the time the doctor confirmed the miscarriage, the hope had slipped away, replaced with a hollow ache that seemed to seep into every part of her being. David offered to cut his trip short, but his voice carried a tone she knew to Wella, a mixture of concern and relief, the sound of a man glad he didn't have to rearrange his calendar. She told him not to come, and he didn't argue. Margaret sent flowers, pale pink roses with a note that made Laura stare at the words in disbelief. Perhaps it's for the best until you're more settled, as if a baby were some accessory. You chose only when your life matched a set of arbitrary standards. Emily's message was sharper, and it came by phone. You know, stress can do these things, she said matter-of-factly. Maybe trying to juggle that little design work of yours wasn't the best idea right now. Laura remembered nodding, muttering something polite, even as her grip on the phone tightened so hard her knuckles went white. She hung up without crying. The tears wouldn't come until Caroline arrived 2 days later, her suitcase in one hand, and a pot of homemade chicken noodle soup in the other. Caroline didn't offer advice. She didn't suggest silver linings or quote hollow platitudes. She simply sat with Laura through the nights, the two of them wrapped in blankets on the couch, watching old black and white movies until one of them dozed off. When Laura woke from restless dreams, Caroline was always there, ready with a hand on her shoulder and a warm mug of tea. The contrast was startling. Her own sister, who lived 2 states away and had a demanding job of her own, had dropped everything to be at her side, and yet David's family, just a short drive across town, sent words on paper and left her to grieve alone. In the weeks that followed, Laura tried to stitch her days back together, but something inside her had shifted. She found herself lingering over her work more often, not because of deadlines, but because designing still gave her a sense of control and purpose. At the same time, the Caldwells' presence in her life began to feel heavier, their judgments louder. David, oblivious or unwilling to see it, kept telling her the same line he'd always used. They mean well. But Laura was beginning to realize that meaning well and being kind were not the same thing. And kindness was in short supply. By the time summer rolled around, she had convinced herself things might settle. Perhaps the annual 4th of July barbecue at the Caldwell's Cape Cod estate would be a chance to turn a corner. Maybe this time she could find her footing among them. She spent 3 hours in the kitchen that morning, making her grandmother's blueberry cobbler recipe that had won rare praise at a past gathering. She wore a light cotton sundress in the shade Margaret had once called effortlessly charming. She wanted more than anything to walk into that party and feel just for a few hours like she belonged. What she didn't know was that this barbecue would not bring reconciliation. It would bring the sentence that changed everything. Sky over Cape Cod was the kind of clear blue that belongs on a postcard. With a light ocean breeze carrying the smell of salt and freshly cut grass, Laura and David pulled up to the Caldwell's summer estate, a sprawling shingle style home with wide porches and a lawn that seemed to stretch all the way to the horizon. David, as usual, was already distracted, scrolling through his phone as he reminded her, "Dad's unveiling the new smoker today. Just try to act impressed, okay?" She nodded, adjusting the covered dish on her lap. Inside was her grandmother's blueberry cobbler, the same one that had earned genuine compliments years before. She'd used the best berries she could find at the farmer's market that morning, hoping it might, in some small way, bridge the distance between her and this family. The moment they stepped into the backyard, the scene was a study in wealth and order. Caterers in crisp uniforms glided between groups of guests, carrying trays of lobster sliders and champagne flutes. Richard Caldwell held court near the smoker, laughing loudly with a half-circle of admirers. Margaret floated from group to group, her pearl necklace catching the sunlight, her laugh as controlled as the rest of her carefully curated image. Emily appeared like she always did, smelling faintly of expensive perfume, her tone light but her eyes sharp. She gave David a warm embrace, then turned to Laura with the kind of polite smile that felt like a glass door between them. "That's a cheerful dress," Emily said, her gaze dipping briefly to the dish in Laura's hands. "The kitchen's a little crowded, but I'm sure you can find somewhere to put." Before Laura could answer, Emily looped her arm through David's and whisked him away to meet an old college friend, leaving Laura standing alone in a sea of strangers. In the kitchen, Margaret was directing the caterers like a general. She glanced over when Laura entered. "Oh, Laura, you didn't have to bring anything. We have the patisserie handling all desserts." She waved vaguely toward a side counter. "But how thoughtful. You can just set it over there for now." Laura placed the cobbler on a shelf already crowded with overlooked contributions, store-bought cookies in plastic clamshells, pies still in grocery store boxes. As she walked out, she overheard Margaret telling a server to make sure Emily's tiramisu was front and center on the dessert table. The next 2 hours passed in polite isolation. Every conversation Laura tried to join ended when someone was pulled away to greet someone important. She wasn't asked to help with anything. Apparently the caterers had a system, and even Richard's typically minimal attention went elsewhere. At lunch, David finally reappeared, guiding Hertz the long picnic table on the flagstone patio. Laura ended up between Richard's elderly uncle, who could barely hear, and an empty chair reserved for Emily. David sat across from her, leaning in toward his father to discuss Japanese business etiquette. When Emily finally arrived, she filled her plate with artfully arranged food and launched into a story about spotting a celebrity at her gym. Everyone laughed at her quips. Even Uncle Frank leaned forward to catch her words. Laura waited for a lull, then took her chance. "I just wrapped a branding project for a new bakery downtown," she said, her tone light. "They're having their grand opening next weekend." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that the one with the tacky neon sign? I drove past it yesterday." "The signage is actually vintage-inspired," Laura explained. "The owners wanted to honor the building's history if you disappeared tomorrow," Emily cut, in her voice carrying across the table. "No one would even notice. That's how boring this conversation is." For a split second, the world seemed to stop. Then laughter rolled around the table. Margaret, behind her napkin, Richard with a loud guffaw, David with a chuckle that cut deeper than the words themselves. Laura felt the blood drain from her face, replaced by a cold clarity she hadn't known in years. She didn't cry. She didn't look down. Instead, she lifted her hot dog and a mock toast, locked eyes with Emily, and said clearly, "Challenge. Accepted." The table fell silent for a beat, just long enough for everyone to sense something had shifted before Margaret clapped her hands and chirped, "Who's ready for brisket?" But the decision was already made. By the time David and Laura left that evening, her mind was no longer circling the question of whether she belonged here. She knew the answer. The only question left was how and when she would walk away for good. The drive home from Cape Cod was unusually quiet. David scrolled through his phone, occasionally sharing updates about his upcoming trip to Tokyo, while Laura stared out the passenger window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The image of Emily's smirk, the sound of David's laugh at her, expense played over in her mind like a bad reel. When they pulled into the driveway, David finally noticed her silence. "Everything okay? You've been off since lunch?" She turned to him. "Emily's comment, did you think that was funny?" He sighed, already unbuckling his seatbelt. "Don't start, Laura. You know how Emily gets. She was just being herself." Laughed, she said simply. "It was a joke," he replied, stepping out of the car. "Not everything needs to be analyzed to death." The conversation was over before it began. David headed upstairs to watch the late news, leaving Laura alone. In the living room, she sat there for a long time, staring at the framed photo of their wedding day on the mantel. In it, she saw a younger version of herself, hopeful, confident, certain she was building a life where she'd be valued. At 2 a.m., she slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to wake him. In the small glow of her home office lamp, she opened her laptop and began searching. Apartments in Portland, Maine. Storage facilities. One-way car rental rates. By dawn, she had a rough plan and a decision that felt as unshakable as bedrock. When David left for an early tea time with his father, he kissed her absently on the cheek and never noticed the set of her jaw. 2 hours later, her college roommate, Jenny, stood in the doorway with cardboard boxes and a determined look. "Tell me what to pack," she said. They worked methodically documents. Her laptop, clothing, personal mementos, and the design equipment she'd invested in over the years. Everything else could be replaced. Jenny offered to store anything. That wouldn't fit in Laura's SUV. In between taping boxes, Laura handled the finances. She transferred exactly half of the joint savings into her personal account, paid her share of the month's bills, and made a list of subscriptions to cancel or redirect. By mid-afternoon, the car was full. Jenny hugged her tightly before heading out. "Call me when you're safe," she said. "And Laura, I'm proud of you." Inside the now half-empty house, Laura took one last look around. She wrote a letter to David, brief, factual, without accusations. She explained she needed space to reevaluate their marriage, had taken only what was hers, and wanted no contact until she was ready. On the kitchen counter, she left the letter, her wedding ring, and a sticky note with Emily's words written. Exactly as they'd been said, she paused in the hallway to pick up the wedding photo, studying it for a moment before placing it back down. "Goodbye," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Driving away from the neat rows of suburban homes, she expected to feel fear. Instead, mile by mile, a strange lightness took hold. By the time she crossed into New Hampshire, she could breathe deeply for the first time in years. That night, she checked into a modest roadside inn in Portland. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The bedspread was faded, but the space was entirely her own. She texted Jenny and her sister, Caroline, to let them know she'd arrived safely, then turned off her phone. She knew that by now, David would have found the letter, would be pacing the kitchen, or perhaps already calling his mother. But instead of guilt or dread, Laura felt only a calm, steady certainty. This was the first day of her new life. Tomorrow, she'd start looking for an apartment. Tonight, she'd sleep, really sleep for the first time in a long, long while. Morning in. Portland broke with a soft, misty rain, the kind that made the harbor look like a watercolor painting. Laura woke in her modest motel room to the sound of gulls and the distant hum of fishing boats heading out to sea. She lay there for a moment, listening, letting the quiet sink in. No clatter of David's coffee grinder, no phone calls from his office echoing down the hall. Just her alone. And the faint scent of salt water drifting in through the cracked window. Caroline was waiting for her at a small diner overlooking the bay. Over steaming mugs of coffee and plates of blueberry pancakes, her sister slid a key across. The table. Month 2-month lease. Furnished. It's a little worn around the edges, but it's yours if you want it. Landlord won't ask questions.
The apartment was on the second floor.
Of a weathered Victorian, its floors creaking underfoot. It had tall bay windows that looked out toward the harbor, a galley kitchen, and just enough space for a desk in the corner. Laura ran her fingers along the chipped countertop and felt an unexpected sense of peace. It's perfect, she said. Her first week was a blur of practical tasks, opening a new bank account, forwarding her mail through Jenny's address, getting a local phone number, and setting up her old laptop at the small writing desk by the window. She logged into the freelance platform she'd abandoned years ago and began carefully curating her portfolio, removing any project tied to Caldwell & Co. Work trickled in slowly at first, designing a flyer for a dog grooming shop, creating a new logo for a yoga instructor, formatting an ebook for a self-published author. It wasn't glamorous, but each completed job felt like a small brick in the foundation of her independence. Then came the day she ducked into a bustling coffee shop during a sudden rainstorm. A sprawling mural covered the back wall vivid blues, warm golds, and intricate line work. She stood admiring it until the barista, a cheerful young woman with a septum ring, said, "Beautiful, right?" The owner had it done by a local artist. She's looking for someone to redesign the menu boards. You should talk to her. An hour later, Laura was seated across from Eleanor Marsh, a silver-haired woman in her late 50s with a no-nonsense air and a streak of paint on her sleeve. "I don't care about your resume," Eleanor said, waving away the portfolio Laura had pulled up. "Show me the work you do when no one's paying you." Hesitating, Laura opened a folder she hadn't touched in years. Experimental designs. Bold color studies and half-finished concepts she'd once created just for the joy of it. Eleanor studied them silently, then looked up with sharp blue eyes. "You've been hiding," she said simply. "These are good. But when's the last time you made something just for you?" "Years," Laura admitted. Eleanor nodded. "You can have the menu job on one condition. You bring me one? Personal piece a week. Doesn't have to be polished, just has to be yours." It was the start of something unexpected. Eleanor became more than a client. She became a mentor. She introduced Laura to other small business owners, a bookstore that needed branding, farmers market looking for signage, a boutique winery wanting new labels. Slowly, Laura's calendar filled, not just with work, but with work she enjoyed. At night, she'd sit by the bay window, harbor lights flickering in the distance, and sketch for herself. The woman in those sketches was starting to look familiar against someone confident, creative, and entirely her own. And though she didn't know it yet, this was the life that would carry her straight into the opportunity and the confrontation that would test just how far she'd come. By late summer, Laura's portfolio looked nothing like it had a year ago. Gone were the watered-down designs that had been Caldwell approved. In their place were bold, vibrant projects menus that practically made you taste the food, wine labels that told a story, brand identities that carried the heartbeat of the business they represented. One Tuesday morning, she was sorting through invoices when her email pinged with a subject line that made her blink, seeking designer for national campaign. The message was from Westbrook Creative, a well-respected Boston agency she'd admired for years. They'd seen her work for Seaside Harvest Foods, small artisan brand whose packaging redesign had just been featured in 3 regional magazines. "We're developing a rebrand for Seacoast Organics," the email read. "We think your aesthetic would be a perfect fit. Would you be open to a meeting next week?" Asterisk her heart skipped. Coast Organics was a big deal. Its products lined shelves from Maine to California. But as she read the brief, detail leaped out at her. Parent company, Caldwell & Co. Marketing. For a moment, the air in her apartment felt heavy. She stared at the words, her mind flashing back to the long picnic table on that Cape Cod patio. Emily's smirk, David's laugh. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony. She called Eleanor that afternoon. "It's the Caldwell's subsidiary," Laura said. "What if they know it's me?" "They might," Eleanor replied. "The question is, do you want the work?" "On your terms." Laura thought about it for 3 days. In the end, she realized avoiding the project would mean letting the Caldwells shadow dictate her choices, and she had promised herself never to live in that shadow again. The following week, she took the train to Boston for her meeting. Westbrook's creative director, Thomas Green, was a tall, affable man in his 40s, with an easy laugh and a firm handshake. There was no hint he knew anything about her past. Connection to the client. They discussed timelines, budget, and creative vision. He seemed genuinely excited about what she could bring to the table. "Seacoast wants this line to feel fresh, but grounded," Thomas explained. "Organic without being folksy, sophisticated but still approachable." "That's my sweet spot," Laura said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. She signed the contract that afternoon, for the next 3 weeks. She worked like a woman on fire. Concepts flowed, easy, crisp typography paired with warm, natural colors. Packaging designs that hinted at the coastline without falling into cliché. Thomas was thrilled. The client's early feedback was glowing. No Caldwell names appeared on the email chains. Then came the announcement. Seacoast Organics would unveil the new look at the New England Marketing Innovation Gala in Boston, one of the industry's biggest annual events. As lead designer, Laura's presence was highly encouraged. Her pulse quickened as she read the invitation. She knew exactly who else would be there. Richard Caldwell never missed an event where his company's name could be polished. If Richard was there, so would Margaret. And Emily. When she mentioned it in her next therapy session, Dr. Lewis leaned back in her chair. "You have 3 options," she said. "Skip the gala and lose a networking opportunity. Go and avoid them, which may be impossible. Or go and be ready to engage on your terms." That night, Laura poured herself a glass of wine and stood at her bay window, watching the harbor lights shimmer. The old Laura would have declined. The woman she was now booked a personal stylist the next morning and set aside part of her advance to invest in an outfit that would feel like armor. On the evening of the gala, she stepped out of her Boston hotel room in a deep emerald silk jumpsuit, her caramel-streaked bob framing a face that no longer carried apology in its eyes. The designer heels gave her 3 extra inches, but it was the quiet confidence in her step that made her taller. This time, she wasn't coming as anyone's wife. She was arriving as the woman who had built herself from the ground up and who was ready, finally, to see the Caldwell's face, face. The historic theater hosting the New England Marketing Innovation Gala was a swirl of crystal chandeliers, polished marble, and the low hum of industry chatter. Laura paused at the entrance, taking in the space. It was the sort of room where the Caldwells moved like they owned the air itself. Tonight, she intended to breathe it on her own terms. Thomas spotted her almost immediately. "Laura, there you are," he said warmly, ushering her toward a group of executives. She shook hands, exchanged cards, and discussed design trends with people who actually listened when she spoke. Her voice was steady, her points considered, and her laugh came easily. About 40 minutes in, she felt the shift in the room's energy. She didn't need to turn to know why. Richard Caldwell's booming laugh carried across the space, followed by Margaret's polished smile and a small cluster of admirers orbiting them. Emily was nowhere in sight yet, but Laura knew it was only a matter of time. She didn't shrink back. She finished her conversation with a magazine editor, excused herself gracefully, and made her way to the bar for a sparkling water. "Laura," a familiar voice said behind her. She turned to find Richard himself, looking as startled as she'd ever seen him. Quite a surprise, he said, masking it quickly. I'm the lead designer on Seacoast's rebrand, she replied evenly. His brow furrowed for a fraction of a second. I hadn't made the connection. The work is impressive. Thank you, she said. It's been a rewarding project, Richard nodded, clearly recalibrating. Margaret's here somewhere. She'd want to say hello. If she'd like, Laura answered politely. It's neither inviting nor refusing. He moved off, and Laura rejoined Thomas and the Westbrook team. From the corner of her eye, she saw Richard lean toward Margaret, whose smile froze briefly before she scanned the room. It was Emily who intercepted her first. No one told me you were working on this project, Emily said, voice light but eyes measuring. Emily, Laura said with a professional smile. This is Thomas Green Westbrooks, creative director. Laura's been exceptional, Thomas said without hesitation. We're family, Emily added quickly. Or were. How nice, Thomas replied neutrally. Excuse us, we need to get ready for the presentation. In fact, the presentation itself was electric. Laura spoke with clarity and authority about the design choices, tying each element to Seacoast's brand story. The applause was genuine, the follow-up questions engaged. From the stage, she could see the Caldwells seated together. Margaret's expression was composed. Richard nodded at certain points. And Emily leaned toward a colleague, whispering something unreadable. Afterward, David approached alone. He looked older, his tailored suit hanging a bit looser than before. You look well, he said. Thank you, Laura replied. I've thought a lot about what happened, he continued. About that day on the patio, about not standing up for you. I didn't get it then. I do now. I'm glad to hear. That, she said, meaning it. I miss you, he admitted quietly. There was a time when those words would have undone her. Now, they landed softly and without pull. I'm meeting my team for dinner, she said gently. David nodded. Maybe we could get coffee tomorrow? Just to talk? I can spare half an hour, she agreed. Later at the dessert table, Margaret appeared at her side. Darling, what a delight to see you thriving, she said with practiced warmth. That's interesting, Laura said lightly. I recall my cobbler ending up in the pantry, while Emily's tiramisu took center stage. Margaret's smile faltered, then recovered. A misunderstanding, I'm sure. Several over 7 years, Laura replied, still smiling. How fortunate that I now work in environments where misunderstandings are rare. Margaret said. Nothing. By evening's end, Laura had collected business cards from half a dozen new contacts, secured 2 tentative project offers, and left the gala on her own terms. She didn't feel like she'd won anything against the Caldwells. She'd simply stepped into a space where their approval no longer mattered, and that, she thought, as she walked into the cool Boston night, was the real victory. The morning. After the gala, Laura met David for coffee in the quiet lobby cafe of her hotel. They talked for nearly an hour about his decision to start therapy, about how he'd begun to see the cracks in his family's behavior, about the ways both of them had changed. When he finally asked if there was a chance to start over, she met his eyes and said gently, I think we both needed to become different people, and I like who I'm becoming now. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just clarity. By spring, the Seacoast Organics campaign had launched too. Industry praise. The visibility brought in new clients, ones who valued her creative vision without trying to reshape it into something else. She rented a small studio space in Portland's Arts District, and for the first time since college, felt part of a creative community again. One Saturday at the farmer's market, she ran into Emily. There was no designer dress this time, just jeans, sneakers, and the small swell of pregnancy visible under her sweatshirt. After an awkward pause, Emily admitted she'd been thinking about what Laura had said at the conference. I don't want my child to feel like they have to disappear. To be seen, she said quietly. Laura nodded. That's a good place to start. They didn't hug. They didn't promise to stay in touch. But they parted without the usual sharp edges, as if some unspoken truce had been reached. 6 weeks later, Laura closed on a small cedar-shingled house near the water, a place with sunlit windows, a garden patch out back, and enough room for her art supplies. paid for entirely with her own earnings. It felt like the truest measure of how far she'd come. On the first evening in her new home, she stood on the porch as the tide rolled in, reflecting on the year behind her. She thought about the cruel comment that had started it all: if you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice. How wrong that had been. By disappearing from the Caldwell's world, she'd become more visible than ever in her work, in her friendships, and most importantly, in her own eyes. She had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to fight for a place at someone else's table, but to build your own table, and invite the people who see your worth without you having to prove it. No matter your age, it is never too late to reclaim your voice, your space, and your self-worth. Sometimes walking away isn't giving up, it's giving yourself permission to grow in the right direction. The relationships, jobs, or environments that constantly make you feel less than will never be the soil where you truly thrive. You deserve to be in places where your presence matters, where your absence would be felt, and where your value is never up for debate. Have you ever had a moment when someone's words pushed you to make a life-changing decision? Love